The morning mist clung to the headstones like whispered prayers as Thomas Sullivan made his way through Cedar Hill Cemetery, his weathered hands gripping the handle of an old wheelbarrow filled with gardening tools. At 98, his back was bent but his stride remained steady, each step deliberate and purposeful across the dew-soaked grass. For 37 years he had been the caretaker of this quiet place, tending to the graves of strangers with the same meticulous care he had once reserved for his fallen brothers. Tommy, as the few people who knew him called him, lived a life of deliberate invisibility. He arrived at the cemetery before dawn, worked until dusk, and returned to his small apartment above the hardware store on Main Street. The townspeople of Cedar Falls, Iowa, knew him as the quiet old man who kept their cemetery pristine, but they knew nothing of the weight he carried in his chest, nothing of the coordinates tattooed on his forearm that marked the exact spot where he had died and been reborn on a blood-soaked beach in France 80 years ago. The tattoo was faded now, barely visible beneath the liver spots and wrinkled skin of extreme old age. But Tommy could still feel it burning some mornings when he woke from dreams that weren't dreams, but memories. The numbers 49 degree 2 Queen 0 dig 51 W with a small cross beneath them, coordinates that marked Sector Dog Green of Omaha Beach, where Private Thomas Sullivan of the 1st Infantry Division had officially died on June 6, 1944, at 6:47 a.m. Except he hadn't died. Not really. The weight of that contradiction had shaped every day of the 8 decades that followed. Tommy had learned to live with the peculiar burden of being a dead man walking, of existing in the space between worlds where the living couldn't reach him and the dead wouldn't claim him. He had become a curator of final resting places, finding in the silent company of the deceased a peace that the world of the living had never offered. His daily routine was sacred, almost ritualistic in its precision. Each morning, he would begin at the northeast corner of the cemetery, where the oldest graves lay beneath towering oak trees that had witnessed a century of grief and remembrance. He would work his way methodically through the rows, pulling weeds, cleaning headstones, replacing wilted flowers with fresh ones from the small greenhouse he maintained behind the cemetery office. Tommy paused at the grave of Margaret Chen, a young mother who had passed the previous winter, and began pulling weeds from around her headstone. He had developed a habit over the decades of talking to the dead, finding them better listeners than the living. "Morning, Maggie," he whispered, his voice barely audible above the rustling leaves. "Your boy came by yesterday, left those yellow roses you always loved. He's doing well, got that promotion at the bank, you'd be proud." The routine was sacred to him. Each grave received personal attention. Each headstone was cleaned with care. Each plot was maintained as if it belonged to family. In a way, they did. The dead had become his congregation, his community, his absolution. He understood them in a way he had never understood the living. They had crossed over, found their peace while he remained trapped in the space between worlds, neither fully alive nor properly dead. Tommy's apartment above Brennan's hardware store was a testament to a life lived in the margins. The rooms were sparse but clean, furnished with pieces he had collected over the decades from estate sales and thrift stores. The walls were bare, except for a single photograph, a faded black-and-white image of his unit taken in England just before the invasion. 23 young faces stared back from the frame, their eyes bright with the confidence of youth and the certainty that they would all be coming home. Tommy was the only one who had. His kitchen table was scarred and worn, marked by decades of solitary meals eaten in silence. The refrigerator held the basics: milk that often went sour before he could finish it, bread for the simple sandwiches that comprised most of his meals, and the medications that kept his aging body functional. He had learned to cook for one, to shop for one, to live for one. Skills that had served him well in his self-imposed exile from the world. The evenings were the hardest. When the sun set and the cemetery grew quiet, when the last visitor had paid their respects and gone home to families and lives that continued beyond the gates, Tommy would sit in his worn armchair by the window and watch the shadows lengthen across the headstones. Sometimes he would read, military histories mostly, accounts of battles he had fought in and wars that had followed. But more often, he would simply sit and remember, allowing the ghosts of his past to visit him in the growing darkness. It was Tuesday when everything changed. Tommy had finished his morning rounds and was heading into town for his weekly supply run. The walk to Brennan's pharmacy took him down Elm Street, past the barber shop where old men gathered to discuss weather and politics, past the diner where families shared Sunday breakfast, past the small-town life he observed but never joined. The barber shop was particularly busy that morning, filled with the usual collection of retirees who had made it their unofficial headquarters. Through the window, Tommy could see Harold Brennan holding court, his hands gesturing animatedly as he told some story that had the other men laughing. Tommy had been invited to join their informal club dozens of times over the years, but he had always declined. What would he tell them about himself? How could he explain a life that officially didn't exist? The diner was equally lively, filled with the breakfast crowd of farmers, shop owners, and early commuters. Tommy could smell bacon and coffee through the open door, could hear the clatter of dishes and the comfortable murmur of conversation. He had eaten there exactly once on his first day in Cedar Falls 37 years ago, and the experience had been so overwhelming, the noise, the questions, the simple human contact, that he had never returned. The automatic doors of the pharmacy whooshed open, and Tommy stepped inside, immediately overwhelmed by the fluorescent lights and chemical smells that always made him dizzy. He had been experiencing more frequent dizzy spells lately, though he attributed them to age rather than anything more serious. At 98, every day was borrowed time, and he had long ago made peace with the fact that his borrowed time was running out. The pharmacy was busier than usual, filled with the Tuesday morning crowd of seniors picking up prescriptions and mothers shopping for school supplies. Tommy made his way carefully through the aisles, avoiding eye contact with the other customers, focusing on his simple mission: arthritis medication, antacid tablets, and the blood pressure pills that his doctor in Cedar Rapids had prescribed during his last visit 6 months ago. He made his way to the back of the store, searching for the arthritis medication that helped with the constant ache in his joints. The pain had been getting worse lately, a deep grinding sensation that seemed to emanate from his very bones. He suspected it was more than simple arthritis. The shrapnel wounds from Omaha Beach had never properly healed, and 8 decades of physical labor had taken their toll on his body. The higher shelves required him to stretch, and as he reached for a bottle of ibuprofen, his balance shifted. The world tilted sideways, and Tommy felt himself falling, his body crashing into a display of vitamins that scattered across the linoleum floor like oversized confetti. The sound of bottles hitting the floor seemed impossibly loud in the quiet pharmacy, and Tommy felt a familiar surge of panic, the same feeling he had experienced on the beach when the mortars started falling. "Sir, are you okay?" A young woman's voice cut through the ringing in his ears. Tommy tried to push himself up, but his left arm wouldn't cooperate. Pain shot from his wrist to his shoulder, and he could feel something warm and wet trickling down his forearm. The metallic smell of blood mixed with the antiseptic odor of the pharmacy, creating a combination that transported him instantly back to the aid stations of Normandy. "Don't try to move," the voice said, gentle but authoritative. "I'm a nurse, let me take a look." Tommy found himself staring up at a woman in her early 30s, with kind brown eyes and dark hair pulled back in a ponytail. Her name tag read Emma Rodriguez, RN. She knelt beside him, her hands moving with practiced efficiency as she assessed his condition. There was something about her touch, gentle but confident, that reminded him of the medics he had known during the war, men who had learned to project calm in the midst of chaos. "I think you've got a pretty good cut on your arm," Emma said, carefully rolling up his sleeve. "We need to clean this up and see if you need stitches. Can you tell me your name?" "Tommy," he said automatically, then caught himself. Thomas Sullivan." "Okay, Thomas, I'm Emma. Can you tell me what happened? Did you feel dizzy before you fell?" As Emma worked to examine his arm, Tommy found himself studying her face. There was something familiar about her features, something that nagged at the edges of his memory. Her skin was olive-toned, her cheekbones high and pronounced, and when she concentrated, she had a habit of biting her lower lip that reminded him of someone he had known long ago. "I think you've got a pretty good cut on your arm," Emma said, carefully rolling up his sleeve. "We need to clean this up and see if you need stitches." As the fabric moved up his forearm, Tommy's heart stopped. The tattoo. After decades of keeping it hidden, of wearing long sleeves even in the hottest Iowa summers, his secret was exposed. The faded numbers and cross were clearly visible against his pale skin, and he watched Emma's expression change from professional concern to something else entirely. Her hands froze. Her eyes widened. She stared at the tattoo for a long moment, then looked up at Tommy's face with an expression of disbelief. When she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "Those coordinates," she said. 49-22N, 0D-351W, those are Omaha Beach. Tommy's blood turned to ice. In all his years of hiding, no one had ever recognized the significance of those numbers. He tried to pull his arm away, but Emma's grip was gentle but firm. Her eyes were fixed on the tattoo, and he could see her mind working, processing the implications of what she was seeing. "Sir, how do you have the exact coordinates of Omaha Beach tattooed on your arm?" "I don't know what you're talking about," Tommy said, his voice shaking. It's just numbers. Old numbers doesn't mean anything." But Emma wasn't buying it. Her grandfather had been a military historian, and she had grown up surrounded by maps and books about World War II. She knew those coordinates by heart. They marked the bloodiest section of the bloodiest beach of the most important day in modern history. More than that, they marked the exact location where her grandfather had spent decades researching an unsolved mystery. The identity of an unknown soldier who had saved 8 men and then vanished into history. "My grandfather spent his entire career studying D-Day," Emma said softly. "I've seen those coordinates 1,000 times. You were there, weren't you? You were at Omaha Beach." Tommy closed his eyes, feeling the weight of 80 years pressing down on his chest. The carefully constructed walls he had built around his secret were crumbling, and he could feel the panic rising in his throat like bile. "Please," he whispered. "Please just help me up. I need to go home." But Emma was already thinking, her mind racing through possibilities. A man this old who had been at Omaha Beach would have been in his late teens or early 20s in 1944. The tattoo suggested something more than just being present. It suggested something significant had happened at those exact coordinates. And the way he was reacting, the fear in his eyes, the desperate attempt to hide the truth, it all pointed to something extraordinary. "What's your name?" she asked again, more gently this time. "Tommy." Tommy Sullivan. Emma's breath caught. Sullivan. She had heard that name before in her grandfather's stories. There had been a Sullivan at Omaha Beach, someone her grandfather had researched extensively. Someone who had died in the first wave, according to the official records, but whose story had never quite added up. Her grandfather had spent years trying to piece together what had really happened to Thomas Sullivan, convinced that the official account was incomplete. "Mr. Sullivan, I'm going to help you get cleaned up, and then I think we need to talk. My grandfather." He knew about a Thomas Sullivan who was at Omaha Beach, but according to the records, that Thomas Sullivan died on June 6, 1944. Tommy's world began to crumble around him. The careful life he had built, the decades of anonymity, the protective shell of invisibility, it was all falling apart because of a simple fall in a pharmacy. He looked at this young woman with her kind eyes and gentle hands, and for the first time in 80 years, he felt the overwhelming urge to tell someone the truth. "He did die," Tommy said quietly. "Thomas Sullivan died on that beach. I've just been walking around ever since." Emma helped him to his feet and guided him to a chair in the pharmacy's consultation area. She cleaned his wound with careful precision, but her mind was elsewhere, trying to piece together the impossible puzzle sitting before her. As she worked, she noticed other details. The way he held himself with military bearing despite his age, the small scars on his hands that looked like old shrapnel wounds, the haunted quality in his pale blue eyes that she had seen in other veterans. The consultation area was small and private, separated from the main pharmacy by a thin partition. Emma had used it countless times to counsel patients about their medications, but she had never had a conversation like this. As she cleaned Tommy's wound, she found herself studying his face, looking for clues to the mystery that had consumed her grandfather's final years. "Mr. Sullivan," she said as she applied a bandage to his arm, "I think you need to tell me what really happened on that beach." Tommy was quiet for a long time, staring at his hands folded in his lap. The hands were gnarled now, marked by decades of physical labor and the inevitable ravages of age, but Emma could see the faint scars that told the story of his youth, small, precise marks that could only have come from shrapnel, and the telltale calluses of a man who had once carried a rifle. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper, and Emma had to lean forward to hear him. I was 19 years old, just a kid from Boston who thought he was going to save the world. My father had died when I was 12, and my mother was working 2 jobs just to keep food on the table. My little sister Mary was only 14, still in school, still believing that her big brother was going to come home and make everything better. He paused, his eyes distant, seeing not the bright pharmacy but the grey dawn of June 6, 1944. They put us on those landing craft at 4 a.m., and we could hear the guns already firing from the ships behind us. The older guys, the ones who had been in North Africa and Sicily, they knew what was coming. They sat quiet, checking their gear, writing letters they hoped they'd never have to send. But us new guys, we thought it would be like the movies. We thought we'd charge up the beach, plant the flag, and be home by Christmas. Tommy's voice grew stronger as he continued, as if the act of finally telling the story was giving him strength. Our boat was in the first wave, sector dog green, right in front of the German strongpoints. The Navy had been shelling the beach for hours, and we thought they'd knocked out all the defenses. We were wrong. The Germans had built their bunkers deep, reinforced them with concrete and steel. Our shells had barely scratched them. He looked up at Emma, and she could see the 19-year-old boy still trapped behind his ancient eyes. The ramp dropped at 6:30 a.m., and the machine guns opened up before the first man could even step into the water. I watched my sergeant's head just disappear. 1 second he was there shouting orders, and the next second there was just nothing. The boy next to me, Jimmy Kowalski from Chicago, he was cut in half before he made it 3 steps. Just a kid, 18 years old, used to talk about the girl he was going to marry when he got home. Emma found herself holding her breath, afraid to interrupt the first telling of a story that had been buried for 8 decades. The water was red, Tommy continued. Not pink, not tinted, red like paint. Bodies floating everywhere. Boys crying for their mothers. The sound of the bullets hitting the water around us sounded like rain on a tin roof, except it was death falling from the sky. I made it maybe 20 yards before I went down, took a bullet in the leg and another in the shoulder. Should have been the end of it right there. He paused, his hands beginning to shake, and Emma reached out to steady them. But I didn't die. I crawled behind some tank obstacles while the Germans kept firing. That's when I saw them. 8 boys from my unit, wounded, bleeding out in the sand. The medics couldn't get to them. Anyone who tried to move got cut down. I watched 3 corpsmen die trying to reach just 1 wounded soldier. Tommy's voice broke, and Emma could see tears forming in his eyes. I don't know what came over me. Maybe it was training, maybe it was stupidity, maybe it was just that I couldn't watch them die. These were boys I'd trained with, eaten with, shared foxholes with in England. They had families back home, girls waiting for them, futures that were bleeding out into the sand. You saved 8 men, Emma said, awe creeping into her voice. I tried to save 8 men, Tommy corrected. Don't know if I succeeded. I started crawling from one to the other, dragging them back to a little depression in the sand behind some rocks. Took me 12 hours. 12 hours of crawling through hell, pulling boys to safety while the Germans tried to kill us all. Tommy's description of those 12 hours was harrowing in its detail. He told Emma about Private Robert Chen, barely 19, who had taken shrapnel to the chest and was coughing up blood. Chen kept talking about his family's restaurant in San Francisco, how he was going to help his father expand the business when he got home. Tommy had torn strips from his own uniform to bandage Chen's wounds, whispering encouragement while machine gun bullets whined overhead. There was Corporal James Mitchell, shot through the leg and shoulder, who kept asking about his girlfriend back in Minneapolis. Mitchell had her picture in his helmet, and he made Tommy promise to mail it to her if he didn't make it. Tommy had dragged Mitchell 50 yards through the sand, stopping every few feet to check his pulse and whisper reassurances. Sergeant William Torres had been the worst. Caught in a flamethrower attack, his uniform was burned away and his skin was charred and blistered. He should have died within minutes, but somehow he held on, talking deliriously about his little sister back in Texas, how he was going to buy her a bicycle for her birthday. Tommy had poured precious water from his canteen onto Torres's burns, knowing it might not be enough, but unable to do nothing. Each one of them had a story, Tommy told Emma. Each one had people waiting for them back home. I couldn't let them die alone on that beach. I couldn't let their families wonder what had happened to them. The other 5 soldiers had their own stories of wounds and hope, of families and dreams that hung in the balance, while Tommy crawled through hell to save them. He told Emma about Private Danny O'Brien, who had been hit in the stomach and was trying to hold his intestines in with his hands. O'Brien kept talking about his mother's cooking, how she made the best apple pie in all of Boston. Tommy had used his own field dressing to bandage O'Brien's wounds, knowing it probably wasn't enough, but refusing to give up. Around 6 p.m., a mortar round landed right next to our little hiding spot, Tommy continued. The explosion, it buried me alive, covered me in sand and rocks and pieces of things I don't want to remember. When I woke up, it was 3 days later, and everything had changed. Tommy's voice broke, and Emma could see tears streaming down his face. A French family had dug me out. The Dubois family, Henri and Marie and their teenage daughter Claudette. They found me unconscious under all that debris and thought I was dead at first. They took me to their farmhouse, nursed me back to health. Henri had been a medic in the First War, and he knew how to treat my wounds. Marie fed me soup and bread, and Claudette read to me from French novels to help pass the time. He paused, struggling with the words. But by the time I was strong enough to think clearly, to remember who I was and what had happened, I learned something that changed everything. The army had already declared me dead, killed in action, June 6, 1944, 6:47 a.m. My mother back in Boston had already received the telegram. She had already held my funeral. She had already started receiving the death benefits. Emma began to understand the magnitude of what she was hearing. My father had died when I was 12, Tommy continued. My mother was working 2 jobs just to keep food on the table, cleaning offices at night, taking in laundry during the day. My little sister Mary was only 14, smart as a whip, but about to drop out of school to work in the factories. That death benefit, that pension, it was more money than my mother had ever seen. It meant Mary could stay in school instead of working in the factories. It meant my mother could afford to keep our apartment, could stop working herself to death. So you stayed dead, Emma whispered. I stayed dead. The French family helped me get new papers, a new identity. I worked on their farm for 2 years, learning French, learning to be someone else. Henri taught me about farming, about working with my hands. Marie taught me to cook simple meals, to take care of myself. Claudette taught me to read French, and through the books I learned about philosophy, about finding meaning in suffering. Tommy looked directly at Emma, and she could see the weight of 8 decades of guilt and loneliness in his expression. I told myself I was protecting them, that coming back would destroy the stability my death had given them. But the truth is, I was a coward. I was broken by what I saw on that beach, and I didn't know how to go back to being the boy who had left Boston. So I became someone else. I became a ghost. The story of Tommy's journey from France to Iowa was a tale of careful reinvention. He had worked his way across Europe, taking odd jobs and learning new skills, always moving, always careful to avoid attention. In 1947, he had managed to get passage to England, where he worked in a factory for 6 months before finding a ship to New York. But he hadn't gone to New York as Thomas Sullivan. He had become Thomas Sullivan's cousin, a distant relative who had emigrated before the war and was now returning to America. The new identity had been surprisingly easy to maintain. Post-war America was full of displaced persons, refugees, and immigrants starting new lives. A quiet man with a slight accent and a willingness to work hard could disappear into the crowd without much difficulty. Tommy had worked his way west, taking jobs in factories and farms, always moving when people started asking too many questions about his past. He had arrived in Cedar Falls in 1987, drawn by a help-wanted ad for a cemetery caretaker. The job had seemed perfect, solitary, peaceful, and surrounded by people who wouldn't ask questions. The previous caretaker had died suddenly, and the city was desperate to find someone who could start immediately. Tommy had presented his carefully crafted credentials and references, and within a week, he was living in the small apartment above the hardware store and tending to the graves of strangers. Emma sat in stunned silence, trying to process the magnitude of the story she had just heard. This quiet old man who tended graves in a small Iowa town was a genuine hero of D-Day, a man who had saved lives under impossible circumstances and then sacrificed his own identity to protect his family. "Mr. Sullivan," she said finally, "do you know what happened to the men you saved?" Tommy shook his head. "I never found out. I was afraid to look, afraid to draw attention to myself. For 80 years I've wondered if they lived, if they made it home, if saving them meant anything at all. Sometimes I would see a name in the newspaper, an obituary for someone with the right age, and I would wonder if it was one of them. But I never had the courage to find out for sure." Emma's mind was racing. Her grandfather had passed away 5 years earlier, but he had left behind an extensive archive of D-Day research. If anyone would have information about the men Thomas Sullivan had saved, it would be in those files. Her grandfather, Dr. Miguel Rodriguez, had been obsessed with documenting the stories of ordinary soldiers who had done extraordinary things, and he had spent decades tracking down survivors and recording their testimonies. "Mr. Sullivan, I think I can help you find out. My grandfather documented everything about Omaha Beach, every unit, every casualty, every act of heroism. If those men survived, if they went on to live their lives, he would have recorded it." For the first time since Emma had met him, Tommy's expression showed something other than resignation. A flicker of hope, quickly suppressed, but unmistakably there. "I don't know if I want to know," he said. "What if they died anyway? What if everything I sacrificed was for nothing? What if they lived?" Emma countered. "What if they went home and had families and careers and full lives because of what you did? Don't you think you deserve to know that your sacrifice mattered?" Tommy was quiet for a long time, staring at the bandage on his arm, where his secret had been hidden for so many years. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely audible. "There's something else," he said. "Something I haven't told you. I'm dying." Emma's heart sank. "What do you mean?" "Cancer, pancreatic. The doctor in Cedar Rapids gave me maybe 2 months, probably less. I haven't told anyone because there isn't anyone to tell. I was planning to just fade away, like I've been doing for 80 years. The cemetery has arrangements with a funeral home in town. They'll handle everything when the time comes." Emma felt a surge of determination. This man had spent 8 decades believing he was a coward when he was actually a hero. He was going to die thinking his sacrifice had been meaningless when it might have been one of the most meaningful acts in the history of warfare. "Mr. Sullivan, will you let me research this? Will you let me find out what happened to those men?" Tommy looked at her for a long moment, this young woman who had stumbled into his secret and was offering him something he had never dared hope for, the truth about whether his life had mattered. "Okay," he said quietly, "but I have one condition. If we do this, if we find out what happened, I want to visit their graves. I want to pay my respects to the boys who didn't make it home. And if they lived?" Tommy smiled for the first time since Emma had met him, and for a moment she could see the young soldier he had once been. "Then maybe I can finally forgive myself for surviving." Emma spent the next week diving into her grandfather's archives. The basement of her childhood home was filled with filing cabinets, maps, photographs, and documents that chronicled every aspect of the D-Day landings. Her grandfather, Dr. Miguel Rodriguez, had been obsessed with preserving the stories of ordinary soldiers who had done extraordinary things. He had spent 40 years collecting testimonies, tracking down survivors, and documenting acts of heroism that had been overlooked by official histories. The basement was organized with military precision, each filing cabinet labeled by unit, date, and location. Emma knew exactly where to look for information about Omaha Beach, but she had never paid much attention to her grandfather's work before. Now, surrounded by the accumulated research of a lifetime, she began to understand the scope of his obsession. She found the file on Thomas Sullivan on her 3rd day of searching. It was thick, much thicker than she had expected, and as she opened it, she understood why. Her grandfather hadn't just documented Sullivan's death. He had spent years trying to piece together what had happened in those crucial hours on Omaha Beach. The file contained witness statements from survivors, German military records captured after the war, and most importantly, detailed accounts from 8 men who had been saved by an unknown soldier in Sector Dog Green. Her grandfather had interviewed all 8 survivors in the 1970s and 1980s, documenting their stories, as part of his larger project on unsung heroes of D-Day. Each interview had been transcribed and cross-referenced with military records, medical reports, and personal correspondence. The level of detail was extraordinary, and as Emma read through the testimonies, she began to understand why her grandfather had become obsessed with finding the mysterious soldier who had saved these men. Emma's hands shook as she read the testimonies. Corporal James Mitchell, age 20, shot through the leg and shoulder. This soldier, I never got his name, he crawled through machine gun fire for hours to drag me to safety. Kept telling me I was going to make it home to see my girl. He was right. I married her in 1946. We had 5 kids, 14 grandchildren. Every time I look at them, I think about that soldier who saved my life. He couldn't have been more than 19 himself, but he moved like he'd been doing this his whole life. Calm under fire, never stopped talking to us, keeping us conscious. I became a teacher because of him. Figured I owed it to him to make something of the life he saved. Private First Class Robert Chen, age 19, shrapnel wounds to the chest. The guy who saved me had a Boston accent, kept talking about his little sister back home. He tore strips from his own uniform to bandage my wounds, used his own water to clean them. I was coughing up blood, thought I was going to die for sure. But he kept telling me about his sister, how she was going to be a teacher someday, how I had to live to see what she accomplished. I became a doctor because of him. Figured I owed it to him to save some lives myself. Performed over 15,000 surgeries in my career, saved thousands of lives, all because one soldier decided my life was worth saving. Sergeant William Torres, age 22, severe burns from a flamethrower. I was ready to die on that beach, burns all over my body, couldn't move. This kid dragged me 50 yards through hell, kept pouring water on my wounds, kept telling me about his little sister back home. He said she was smart, going to college someday, going to make the world better. I lived to meet my own little sister, my daughter, born in 1947, started a non-profit organization that helps wounded veterans transition back to civilian life. We've helped over 10,000 veterans over the years, all because one soldier thought my life was worth saving. The testimonies went on, each one a life saved, a future secured, a family created because of Tommy's actions on that terrible day. But it was the final document in the file that took Emma's breath away. Her grandfather had created a comprehensive genealogical chart tracking the descendants of the 8 men Tommy had saved. The numbers were staggering. 47 children, 156 grandchildren, 89 great-grandchildren, and 12 great-great-grandchildren. In total, Tommy's actions on Omaha Beach had directly led to the existence of 304 people. But the impact went beyond mere numbers. Emma read through her grandfather's notes on what these men had accomplished with their saved lives. James Mitchell had become a teacher, educating over 3,000 students during his 40-year career. 17 of his former students had become teachers themselves, creating a ripple effect of education that had touched thousands of lives. Robert Chen had indeed become a doctor, performing over 15,000 surgeries and saving countless lives. He had also established a free clinic in San Francisco's Chinatown that had provided medical care to thousands of immigrants and low-income families. William Torres had started a non-profit organization that helped wounded veterans transition back to civilian life. The organization had grown from a small local group to a national network that had assisted over 10,000 veterans. Private Danny O'Brien had survived his stomach wounds and returned to Boston, where he became a police officer. He had spent 30 years protecting and serving his community, and his son had followed in his footsteps, becoming a detective who specialized in helping crime victims. Corporal Frank Kowalski had become a minister, providing spiritual guidance to thousands of parishioners over a 40-year career. He had also established a program that provided counseling and support to veterans struggling with what would later be recognized as PTSD. Private First Class Anthony Ricci had returned to New York and taken over his family's construction business. Under his leadership, the company had built hundreds of homes, schools, and community centers, providing jobs for thousands of workers and housing for countless families. Sergeant Michael O'Malley had become an engineer, designing bridges and roads that connected communities and facilitated commerce. His innovations in bridge design had been adopted nationwide, improving transportation infrastructure across the country. Private Joseph Nowak had returned to his family's farm in Wisconsin and revolutionized agricultural practices in his region. His innovations in crop rotation and soil conservation had increased yields for hundreds of farmers and helped feed thousands of families. Emma realized she was looking at a mathematical proof of heroism, concrete evidence that one man's courage on one terrible day had rippled through time to touch thousands of lives. The 8 men Tommy had saved had not just survived, they had thrived, and their contributions to society had created an exponential impact that continued to grow with each passing generation. She found Tommy at the cemetery the next morning, kneeling beside a grave she didn't recognize. As she approached, she could see he was talking quietly to the headstone, his voice too low to make out the words. The morning mist was just beginning to lift, and the early sunlight filtered through the oak trees, casting long shadows across the carefully maintained grounds. "Mr. Sullivan?" He looked up, and she could see he had been crying. His eyes were red-rimmed, and there were tear tracks on his weathered cheeks. "This is where I come when it gets too hard," he said, gesturing to the grave. "Margaret Chen. She died last winter. Cancer, like me. But she had a good life. 87 years, 5 children, 14 grandchildren. She used to tell me stories about her father." Emma's heart stopped. "Her father?" "Robert Chen. He was a doctor, saved a lot of lives." She was proud of him. Said he used to tell her about the war, about how some soldier saved his life on a beach in France. Said her father spent his whole career trying to honor that soldier's memory. He established a scholarship fund for medical students, called it the Unknown Soldier Scholarship. Helped hundreds of young people become doctors. Emma knelt beside Tommy, her hands shaking as she pulled out the folder she had brought with her. The irony was almost overwhelming. Tommy had been unknowingly tending the grave of the daughter of one of the men he had saved, listening to stories about himself without ever realizing the connection. "Mr. Sullivan, Robert Chen was one of the men you saved." Tommy's face went white. "What?" "I found my grandfather's research. All 8 men you saved on Omaha Beach, they all survived the war. They all came home. They all lived full lives." Emma opened the folder and showed him the photographs her grandfather had collected. Wedding pictures, family portraits, graduation ceremonies. "This is James Mitchell with his wife. This is Robert Chen at his medical school graduation. This is William Torres with his children." Tommy stared at the photographs, his hands trembling as he touched each image. The faces were older than he remembered, marked by time and experience, but he could still see the young soldiers he had pulled from the sand 80 years ago. "They lived," he whispered. "They all lived." "More than that," Emma said. "They thrived. Between the 8 of them, they had 47 children. Those children had 156 children of their own. Mr. Sullivan, because of what you did on that beach, 304 people exist today who wouldn't have otherwise." Tommy began to sob, 80 years of grief and guilt pouring out of him in great heaving waves. Emma put her arm around his shoulders and let him cry, understanding that these were not tears of sadness, but of relief, the relief of a man finally learning that his life had mattered. "There's more," Emma said gently when his tears had subsided. "My grandfather spent years trying to find the soldier who saved these men. He interviewed dozens of survivors, searched through military records, even traveled to France to investigate. He never found you, but he never stopped looking. He called you the ghost of Omaha Beach, the unknown hero who saved 8 lives and then vanished." Tommy looked up at her with wonder in his eyes. "Someone was looking for me." "Someone was always looking for you. The families of the men you saved, they never forgot. They told their children and grandchildren about the young soldier who risked everything to save their fathers and grandfathers. You've been a legend in 8 families for 80 years. Emma pulled out another document, a letter her grandfather had written but never sent, addressed simply to the unknown soldier of Sector Dog Green. "My grandfather wrote this in 1994 on the 50th anniversary of D-Day. He wanted you to know that your sacrifice hadn't been forgotten." Tommy's hand shook as he unfolded the letter and began to read. "To the unknown soldier of Sector Dog Green, I have spent 20 years searching for you, and I fear I may never find you. But I want you to know that your actions on June 6, 1944, have not been forgotten. 8 men came home because of your courage. 8 families were reunited because of your sacrifice. Hundreds of children and grandchildren exist because you chose to risk everything for strangers. I have interviewed every survivor I could find, and they all tell the same story. A young soldier who crawled through hell to save his brothers, who never gave his name, who disappeared into history like a ghost. They describe you as calm under fire, compassionate in the face of horror, and utterly selfless when it mattered most. I don't know if you survived the war. I don't know if you made it home, but I want you to know that if you did, you deserve to live with pride, not guilt. You deserve to know that your life mattered, that your courage changed the world in ways both large and small. The 8 men you saved went on to become teachers, doctors, ministers, and fathers. They raised children who became leaders, healers, and heroes in their own right. The ripple effects of your actions will continue for generations. You are not forgotten. You are not unknown. You are a hero, whether you believe it or not. With deepest respect and gratitude, Dr. Miguel Rodriguez. Tommy finished reading the letter and sat in silence for a long time, staring at the words that absolved him of 8 decades of guilt. The morning sun had fully risen now, and the cemetery was bathed in golden light. Around them, the carefully tended graves stood as silent witnesses to the conversation that was changing the course of a dying man's final days. He really spent 20 years looking for me? He spent his entire career looking for you, Emma said. And now I've found you. The question is, what do we do now? Tommy looked around the cemetery, at the graves he had tended for so many years, at the peaceful place where he had hidden from the world. For the first time in 8 decades, he felt the possibility of redemption, the chance to step out of the shadows and reclaim his identity. I want to meet them, he said finally, the families. I want to tell them what their fathers and grandfathers meant to me. I want to thank them for giving me a reason to live with what I did. Emma smiled. I think that can be arranged, but first, there's something else we need to do. What's that? We need to bring Thomas Sullivan back from the dead. The process of officially resurrecting Thomas Sullivan took 3 weeks and involved more paperwork than Emma had thought possible. Military records had to be corrected, death certificates had to be amended, and a dozen government agencies had to be convinced that a man declared dead in 1944 was actually very much alive in 2024. The bureaucratic challenges were immense. The Department of Veterans Affairs had no procedures for dealing with a veteran who had been officially dead for 80 years. The Social Security Administration was baffled by the request to create a new identity for someone who had never officially existed. The State Department had to issue new documentation for a man who had been living under an assumed identity for 8 decades. But Emma was persistent, and she had help from unexpected sources. When word of Tommy's story began to spread through the veterans community, offers of assistance poured in from across the country. Lawyers volunteered their services pro bono, genealogists offered to help trace his family history, and veterans organizations provided political pressure to expedite the bureaucratic process. During those 3 weeks, Emma arranged for Tommy to meet with the families of the men he had saved. The first meeting was with James Mitchell's daughter, Patricia, who drove down from Minneapolis with her own children and grandchildren. When Tommy walked into the community center where they had arranged to meet, Patricia took one look at him and burst into tears. "You look just like my father described," she said, embracing him. "He never stopped talking about the soldier who saved his life. He said you couldn't have been more than 19, with kind eyes and a Boston accent. He described you so many times that I feel like I've known you my whole life." Tommy spent 2 hours with Patricia's family, sharing stories about her father's courage on the beach, his determination to survive, his constant talk about the girl he was going to marry when he got home. Patricia showed him photographs spanning her father's entire life, his wedding to the girl he had talked about on the beach, the birth of his children, his career as a teacher, his retirement surrounded by grandchildren. "He did marry her," Patricia said, showing Tommy a photograph of her parents' wedding. They were married for 62 years, had 5 children, 14 grandchildren, and 23 great-grandchildren. All because you saved his life. The emotion in the room was overwhelming. Patricia's children and grandchildren gathered around Tommy, each wanting to shake the hand of the man who had made their existence possible. They shared stories about James Mitchell, about his dedication to education, his love for his family, and his lifelong gratitude to the unknown soldier who had saved him. He established a scholarship fund, Patricia's son told Tommy, the Unknown Hero Scholarship for Children of Veterans. It's helped over 200 kids go to college. He always said he was doing it to honor the soldier who saved him. The meetings continued throughout the week. Robert Chen's family, including his daughter Margaret, whom Tommy had unknowingly befriended at the cemetery, came from San Francisco. Margaret's children brought medical journals containing articles their grandfather had written, research papers that had advanced medical knowledge and saved countless lives. Grandfather never forgot about the soldier who saved him, Margaret's daughter said. He used to say that every life he saved as a doctor was really saved by that unknown soldier on the beach. He established the free clinic in Chinatown because he said he owed a debt that could never be repaid. William Torres's son came from Texas with his own family. He brought photographs of the non-profit organization his father had founded, showing the thousands of veterans who had been helped over the years. The organization had grown from a small local group to a national network with offices in 12 states. Dad always said he was living on borrowed time, Torres's son explained. He said every day after Omaha Beach was a gift from the soldier who saved him. He spent his whole life trying to pay that gift forward. Each family brought similar stories of lives well lived, of contributions to society, of the ripple effects of Tommy's heroism spreading through generations. But it was the final meeting that affected Tommy most deeply. Sarah Mitchell, James Mitchell's granddaughter, was a military historian herself, and she had brought something special, her grandfather's Purple Heart medal. He wanted this to go to the soldier who saved him, she said, placing the medal in Tommy's hands. He carried it with him for 70 years, waiting for the chance to give it to you. He said it belonged to you more than it belonged to him. Tommy stared at the medal, feeling its weight in his palm. The Purple Heart was awarded to soldiers wounded in combat, and James Mitchell had certainly earned it. But the gesture of giving it to Tommy was profound, a recognition that the true sacrifice had been made by the man who had risked everything to save others. I can't take this, Tommy said, his voice shaking. This is his honor, his sacrifice. No, Sarah said firmly. His sacrifice was surviving to come home and live a full life. Your sacrifice was giving up your own life, so he could have his. This medal represents both of your sacrifices. As the meetings concluded, Emma realized that something had changed in Tommy. The haunted look in his eyes had been replaced by something she had never seen before: peace. For the first time in 80 years, Thomas Sullivan was allowing himself to believe that he was a hero rather than a coward. The transformation was remarkable. Tommy's posture straightened, his voice grew stronger, and for the first time since Emma had known him, he began to talk about the future rather than dwelling on the past. He spoke about wanting to visit the graves of the men who hadn't made it home from Omaha Beach, about establishing a scholarship fund for the children of veterans, about finally writing down his story so that future generations would understand the true cost of freedom. The official ceremony took place on a crisp October morning at the Cedar Falls Veterans Memorial. Emma had worked with the local VFW and the mayor's office to organize a proper military honors ceremony for Tommy. Representatives from all 8 families were present, along with local veterans, city officials, and members of the press who had gotten wind of the incredible story. The ceremony began with a presentation of colors by the local VFW Honor Guard, followed by the national anthem sung by the high school choir. Tommy stood at attention throughout, his military bearing evident despite his age. When the time came for him to speak, he approached the podium with steady steps, his voice clear and strong. 80 years ago, I was a 19-year-old kid who thought he knew what courage looked like, Tommy began. I thought courage was charging up a beach with a rifle in your hands, ready to fight the enemy. I learned that day that real courage is much quieter, much more personal. Real courage is crawling through hell to save a stranger. Real courage is living with the consequences of your choices, even when those choices cost you everything you thought you wanted. He paused, looking out at the crowd of faces, young and old, veterans and civilians, the families of the men he had saved, and the community that had unknowingly sheltered him for decades. I spent 80 years thinking I was a coward because I didn't come home when the war ended. I thought I had abandoned my duty, my family, my identity. But I learned something important in these past few weeks. Sometimes the greatest act of courage is letting go of who you were so that others can become who they're meant to be. Tommy was presented with the medals he should have received 80 years earlier. The Purple Heart, the Bronze Star with V device for valor, and the Combat Infantryman badge. But more importantly, he was surrounded by the living legacy of his actions. Dozens of people who existed because of his courage on a beach in France 8 decades earlier. The ceremony concluded with Tommy placing a wreath at the base of the memorial, honoring not just the men whose names were engraved on the stone, but all the soldiers who had never made it home from foreign shores. As he stepped back and saluted, Emma could see tears streaming down his face. Not tears of grief this time, but tears of gratitude. That evening, Tommy returned to his small apartment above the hardware store, but everything had changed. The walls that had once felt like a prison now felt like a sanctuary. The silence that had once been oppressive now felt peaceful. For the first time in 80 years, Thomas Sullivan was truly home. Emma visited him every day that week, bringing him copies of the newspaper articles that had been written about his story, letters from veterans' organizations around the country, and messages from historians who wanted to interview him. The story had captured the national imagination, and requests for interviews were pouring in from major news networks and documentary filmmakers. But Tommy seemed most interested in the simple things. The way the afternoon light fell across his kitchen table, the sound of children playing in the street below, the knowledge that he would soon be reunited with the brothers he had left behind on Omaha Beach. He spent hours looking through the photographs Emma had brought him, studying the faces of the families he had helped create, marveling at the lives that had grown from the seeds of his sacrifice. "I never imagined," he told Emma one afternoon, as they sat in his small living room. "When I was crawling through that sand, pulling those boys to safety, I never imagined that it would lead to all this. I thought I was just trying to keep them alive for another day, another hour. I never thought about the children they would have, the lives they would touch, the difference they would make." Emma had been working on a comprehensive account of Tommy's story, interviewing the families, collecting documents, and piecing together the full scope of his impact. The numbers were staggering. The 8 men he had saved had directly influenced thousands of lives through their careers, their families, and their contributions to society. But the true measure of Tommy's heroism couldn't be captured in statistics. It could only be understood in the stories of individual lives that had been made possible by his courage. On the 7th day after the ceremony, Emma arrived at Tommy's apartment to find him sitting peacefully in his favorite chair, looking out the window at the cemetery where he had worked for so many years. He appeared to be sleeping, but when she checked his pulse, she realized that Thomas Sullivan had finally found the peace that had eluded him for 8 decades. On his nightstand, Emma found a letter addressed to her. "Dear Emma, thank you for giving me the greatest gift anyone has ever given me, the knowledge that my life mattered. For 80 years, I believed I was a coward who had abandoned his family and his duty. You showed me that I was a man who had saved 8 lives and through them touched hundreds more. I'm not afraid to die now. I am ready to join my brothers who fell on that beach, and I can face them with pride instead of shame. I can tell them that their sacrifice was not in vain, that the world they died to protect became a place where 8 good men could live full lives and raise families and make the world a little better. Please continue to tell my story. Not because I want to be remembered as a hero, but because I want people to know that heroes walk among us every day. They are the teachers who inspire children, the doctors who save lives, the parents who raise good kids, the ordinary people who do extraordinary things when the moment demands it. The 8 men I saved on Omaha Beach went on to become heroes in their own right. They saved lives, built communities, and raised children who are making the world better. That is the real victory of D-Day. Not that we won a battle, but that we preserved the possibility for good people to live good lives. I am going to sleep now, and I will not wake up, but I am not sad. I am grateful. Grateful for 98 years of life, grateful for the chance to serve my country, grateful for the privilege of saving my brothers, and grateful for the gift you gave me of knowing that